Hello and welcome to the online graduate research forum for fall 2019. My name is Courtney Perkins and I am a graduate student in the Masters of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies program in the Department of Occupational Workforce and Leadership Studies. The title of my research study is Non-Clinical Staff Servant Leadership Perceptions and Patient Experience Perceptions of Non-Clinical Staff. The reason I was excited to do this research study was because of the population boom and how it affects healthcare. For the baby boomers, there's about 10,000 of them retiring daily. And then in just the Austin area alone, over the past 10 years, we've seen a 34% increase in the population. By 2050, we should be over 5 million. So in order for a healthcare organization like a hospital or a clinic to either gain or retain their market share, they're going to have to provide great patient experience. So I wanted to look at patient experience and also servant leadership with the staff. So the purpose of the study is to examine the perceptions of servant leadership with a non-clinical staff in a hospital setting. And my two research questions were, to what extent do non-clinical staff perceive their servant leadership characteristics? And then my second deals with patient experience, which is, to what extent do patients perceive their overall patient experience? So my original idea for this study was to see how servant leadership with the hospital staff ultimately ends up touching the end user and their patient experience. What I quickly learned is there's a lot of data already on that subject. There's been a lot of studies into how servant leadership with hospital staff helps the hospital staff as well as the patient. But the gap that I found was that it didn't really discuss non-clinical staff. It was always with doctors, nurses, the clinical staff who do the kind of healthcare, direct care. It never talked about the people that support those departments. So I kind of want to look at servant leadership with the non-clinical staff, specifically the patient access who does the admitting, and then also the patient experience scores that directly tie to that department. This is a non-experimental quantitative descriptive study. It's for a small inpatient hospital about 20 miles west of Austin. They have about 114 beds. I centered it around the patient access department of that facility. There's about 17 staff members, a director, manager, and about 15 floor level staff. They admit the patients, they do financial counseling, etc. And the patient mix for this particular facility is mainly Medicare age because of its proximity to Sun City, which is a large retirement community, and that's right outside the hospital. So in order to look at servant leadership, I looked at the 2017 to 2018 employee satisfaction scores for the patient access department only. And then for the patient experience, I looked at the same time frame, 2017 to 2018 patient experience scores, but there's only 3 questions and they tie directly to the patient's access department. And so this is, like I said, this is a quantitative, non-experimental descriptive study. So I'm just looking at those scores and just kind of trying to figure out what they mean and examine those. So for the first variable I used the employee satisfaction scores, which is given out yearly to each department. The corporate standard is that you need to have a metric of 60%, and it needs to be over 60%. So what I did was I ran all the 2-year scores to SPSS and got the mean to kind of gauge how this department fared. And so I looked at 3 separate questions that kind of tied to servant leadership. First was, our company has a vision, strategy, mission for the future. Their mean score was 71%. This one's pretty high. It's probably the second highest score on the survey. And when I say score, I mean it's a favorable score. So that's a Likert scale. And the last 2 on the right column would be agree or strongly agree. So the favorable score for those 2 years would be a aggregated score of 71%. So this is pretty high. And so if you think about it, the mission of any healthcare organization is to serve the patient, and that servitude start at the top if it's management. And so they score pretty high on this, and it looks like this team is pretty motivated to be servants to their patients, which in the end provides great customer care and patient experience. The next question I looked at was, my work gives me a feeling of personal accomplishment. This is the highest score they got, 79%. It's 19 points. It's 19 points over the 60% corporate goal. I think this speaks to a couple of things. I think it speaks to healthcare work in general. I think everybody that works in healthcare kind of feels like it's more than just a job, but I also think it speaks to the department. You can kind of see it from the leaders down that this work is really meaningful to them, and their job is to service not only the patient but also the clinical staff, so the clinical staff can do the healing work. And so I really think that in my research I've seen that this is kind of a core metric, that they really do feel like they're doing something more than registering a patient. And then the last one, which is not the lowest score, but one of the lowest, but it's still above the corporate mean, is all employees are treated with respect regardless of their job. This one's a little bit lower, but it is over the corporate metric of 60%. This is pretty good because, like I said, this is not non-clinical staff. These aren't the hospital employees that many people often remember. So it seems to me that the leadership, whether it's the patient access leadership or the leadership at the hospital, there's a culture of respect there, and you can kind of see that with this metric. So the next variable I looked at was patient perceptions of like their experience, their experience with the non-clinical staff, specifically the patient access department. And I did the same thing, ran it through SPSS and got the mean score. Now the corporate metric on this one's a little bit different. It's 70%. So they expect the mean score to be over 70% favorable. And that is, strongly agree. And so I looked at 3 questions. These are only 3 questions on this survey that is taken that pertains to patient access. So when a patient comes in, what happens is they go through each department, and then about a week later, they get a survey from our survey company called Press Ganey, and they're asked a series of questions that touches every department, and then they take all those scores, and and they send them to each department, and it's a random scattering of patients throughout the week depending on volume. So the 3 questions are: the first one is helpfulness of registration person. So the mean score is 84%. This is the highest one, and it's 14% over the corporate standard of 70%. I think this is really important. I think this speaks directly about the person that was registering the patient. And I think that this shows that this patient, this employee is giving great care to this patient, helping them through a difficult process at the beginning of their journey. And I think that this speaks to a culture of servitude in this department. The next one is ease of registration process. The mean score is 76. Now this is a little bit lower. So this is not speaking about the person, the registrar. This is speaking about the process. So, patients have to sign paperwork. They have to talk about, health insurance. They have to talk about financial matters. This is not an easy process, and also it's kind of long and drawn out. So to be fair, it's over the metric of 70%, but it's lower than the helpfulness of registration person. What I think this speaks to is, I think that while the patients don't necessarily like the registration process, the registrar that is guiding them through this process, they really do like. So I think that, again, this points directly to servitude by the employee. The last one I really kind of discount. It's called waiting time and registration. This has been seen as a major driver in all facilities to be like, for patient experience. Patients don't like waiting. They don't come to the hospital to wait. But the problem with this is registration is actually located in the lobby. So normally the metric is for them to finish registration within 10 minutes, and they do it. This facility meets that regularly. But the problem is when they're set back in the lobby, they're waiting on the clinical staff, they still think they're in registration. Well, technically registration's over. So I didn't really look too deep into this metric because it's not solely the patient access department, but still it's above the metric, so somebody's doing something right. So in regard to perceptions of servant leadership within a patient access department, I think I had the opportunity to look at a high-performing team. I can look at their scores with either patient experience or employee satisfaction and see that there is a spirit of servitude there, and there is, you know, servant leadership being employed in that department. um, and then for patient perceptions of their patient experiences, specifically with the patient access department, they're consistently high scores, they're meeting the metric. And I think what this speaks to is this entire facility, and I think it's a top down perspective. I think that the leaders in this facility have set a culture of servitude, and that's what servant leadership is all about, and that's also what healthcare is all about. And I really enjoyed looking into these metrics. I think that this team is working hard to service their patient and be a servant to them. And also, I think there needs to be, since this was only a descriptive study, I only looked at those two variables. I didn't look at the correlation between them. I think more studies need to be done with servant leadership, patient experience, and non-clinical staff, especially the patient access department. Because the reality is no one goes to the hospital to do paperwork, to pay large sums of money, to talk about healthcare that they don't understand, that they just bought at work. And the patient access department is the shepherds that guide them through that process and make it as quick and as painless as possible so they can get to the clinical department where they're given the care that they need. And I think that the patient access department is also often the first people that the patient sees, so they can color the entire visit. So I think some more studies need to be done, and see their servant leadership on the patient access staff and how that ultimately affects the end user, which is the patient. You can rate my presentation, ask me a question, write a comment below, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.